All right, I am here at the Long Key Nature Center in Davie. I am thrilled to be joined today by archaeologist Bob Carr, who is the foremost expert on South Florida's ancient history. We are going to check out some amazing Tequesta artifacts and walk trails that people have been walking here in Broward County for thousands of years. This is really exciting, so let's get started. I get yelled at all the time in my comments about this, okay? I know there's a Tequesta in Jupiter.
Right.
And we're talking here about the Tequesta. I get yelled at that I am pronouncing it wrong all the time, right?
Okay.
In your expert opinion, how do we pronounce this? And were they even called that in the first place?
Well, first of all, Tequesta and Tequesta are essentially two different entities. So the town of Tequesta is a town that used that name, and of course they say it the way they want to, they can spell it the way they want. But the origin is Tequesta, and it is pronounced that way because it is the Spanish translation of the Indian word that was probably first heard by Ponce de Leon in 1513. So in the earliest accounts, it is written as Tequesta with a C, not a T, because it's being phonetically said and spelled according to what was heard. So the actual pronunciation would be Tequesta.
Great. So that clears that up. I have expert backing on this. Stop yelling at me, people from Jupiter. Anyway, all right, so now that we have that cleared up, tell me a little bit about the Tequesta, who they were, where they came from, when they lived here.
So the Tequesta are the first people, the indigenous people of southeastern Florida. And we know from archaeological investigations that the earliest people in southeast Florida were dating back to 10,000 to 11,000 years ago, so-called Paleo-Indians, which just means old Indians. And that particular early human site is at the Deering Estate in the southern part of Miami. So we know how far back human history goes, and the Tequesta, specifically based on their material culture, seems to go back at least 3,000 years.
In this museum, there's a lot of artifacts. We were just looking at the masks, the replicas that you have on display. What does that tell us about their culture, right? We know who they are and some of what they left behind, but what does it tell us about who they were and what they did?
Well, the discovery of the mask by Frank Hamilton Cushing was a very rare and unique discovery, and it was found in Marco Island, usually associated with the Clusit. But in fact, it's all of the tribes of South Florida were related one way or another, not necessarily the same group. They were different. But the fact that the masks have survived indicates not only a sense of the aesthetics and the art, but not art the way you and I think of art. Nobody was assigned to be an artist on some lofty place in society. But basically, these were craftspeople, and what they were doing is they were copying and respecting the natural order of the universe, which of course is filled with animals and plants and with the cosmology of different gods. So the animals were very important, and these masks are not only an honor to that, but part of ceremonial rituals and different kinds of dances and things that were very important to everyday society.
So a lot of people don't fully appreciate how diverse and complex ancient Florida was. Can you help us frame that a little bit and where the Tequesta fit into it, whether it's broader Florida or even into the Caribbean?
South Florida in general, when native inhabitants were encountered by the first Europeans here, which were the Spanish, they really saw this as a very lowly group of people. They saw them as nomadic, as heathens, and took greatest exception to the fact that the native people of South Florida did not have agriculture, specifically maize or corn agriculture, which from middle to central northern Florida all the way to the eastern part of now the United States, agriculture by that time had become very dominant. So that was the basis of this kind of ethnocentric idea that these people were inferior, not realizing that in fact they were actually a very complex society. They were stratified. They had a cacique, their king. They had different levels. They had a warrior level. They had all of these different classes. And this level of complexity was missed because of these simple prejudices. The fact is that agriculture was always regarded as the basis for creating complex society. And the exception happens to be South Florida and the Pacific Northwest, which, based on maritime culture, was able to achieve also similar complexity. And that's what is exactly what happened here, because the subsistence was largely based on marine resources. Therefore, the option, even though it was available for agriculture, was not important. There was no reason to extend that effort if you had what you needed from the sea and from the interior islands in different locations.
So you mentioned the mounds, and there's mounds everywhere. Right now, they look like hills, right? What would they have looked like at the time, at their peak?
The mounds were very prominent because they were the base, in some cases, for temples or charnel houses. Other mounds were used for human burials, and sometimes it was a combination of the two. And other times, some of these higher mounds were where the chief or the cacique or people with elite status might have had their houses. So the mounds were very discreet, very well manicured. They had steps going up to the top. I mean, you would think of the native people of Mexico and the Mayans when you would see these mounds, although they weren't made out of stone. They didn't have the masonry rock carvings going on. But one reason you have to think about that in terms of what that difference is that the Tequesta and the Clusa didn't have access to hard stone for rocks that you could carve. You know, it was all sand and shell and so forth. So they were just adapting to the reality of their environment.
Just in Tikal in Guatemala, so looking at the pyramids. And they have a similar purpose, it feels like, to some of the mounds here, right? Temples on top. I asked this question to a Maya archaeologist. I want to ask your opinion. The ancient world in the Americas was, I think, better connected than most people acknowledge. Do you ever think at any point in time, Maya, Tequesta, were meeting each other in Cuba or exchanging any type of culture and ideas?
Well, I get that question all the time. And when I started archaeology, that was one of my premises and one of the things I wanted to investigate, because I had heard and read that the indigenous people of South Florida were connected to the Yucatan, to Cuba. And so these were very compelling questions. But with many decades now of research, what I've discovered is that certainly there was definitely some connections. We know that because we've actually found material in Florida that came from Central America. Very rare, but it's happened. I think the bigger question that I've learned culturally, archaeologically, is did those exchanges or did those movements of goods have any significant effect on the culture? And there's no direct evidence of that. So these contexts might have been more peripheral than we'd like to give, that people would like to think. The biggest barrier for contact between Cuba and Florida, of all things, was very similar to the Great Wall of China, which is called the Gulf Stream. So if you try to canoe and paddle your canoe across the Gulf Stream from Cuba, you don't go to Key West. You end up somewhere up the Florida coast towards Central Florida.
Like Narvaez.
Yeah, so that was the barrier, and that's one reason that artifacts from Florida or from the Bahamas exceptionally rare, rarely documented. Nothing really substantial or conclusive has been documented. Likewise, material going from Florida to Cuba is still under discussion and debate, but there's no conclusive evidence of early significant contact. And it's a fascinating question.
For sure.
And I can share with you, there's one spectacular mound that has survived in Key Largo. And when it was first documented in the 1930s, the archaeologists and the scientists involved, they were sure that it was evidence of Mayan contact because it's made out of rocks. It looks like,
really?
Yeah, not cut rocks, but just loose rocks. So it is very imposing. But when we looked at it archaeologically, we found it was the Tequesta, it was their artifacts and so forth.
That's so interesting. What do you want people who visit here to take away from this exhibit?
I want people to see a sense of continuity between themselves and the people who were here before us. And the fact that they're not necessarily our European or African ancestors, whatever you might be, doesn't make any difference. Because when we become custodians of the land, then we have a moral and ethical obligation to curate and to do things for that past history, to maintain it and to learn it and to share it. So my mission has always been to create that bridge between the past and the present.
Right, so I think what a lot of people find hard to imagine is that this was actually a chain of islands in the Everglades. So I'm a visual learner. Can you help me kind of picture what this place would have looked like, let's say 1,000 years ago?
Well, the most important thing to consider is that you were in the middle of the Everglades. Everglades, since, of course, has been drained and all of this has been developed except for this preserve. And what made this distinctive from the Everglades. This was an elevated island, a series of islands that during the Seminole Wars was referred to as Sam Jones' Seven Islands.
Right.
And we're on one of the islands, the most western of the islands. They extended for about 3 or 4 miles east to west as the environment was transitioning into a wetter period, and the Everglades began to form about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And a lot of people don't realize the Everglades is probably no more than 6,000 to 8,000 years old.
Okay.
Then the islands took form with supporting upland vegetation, in this case, hardwood hammocks, different kinds of trees. And of course, not only attractive for certain animals to live here, but for humans. So this was the ideal place to live.
That's what I was thinking, because I usually don't associate the Everglades with an ideal place to live, right? So what were some of those aspects that made this place so appealing for people, dating back as far as...
Well, at least 5,000 years.
Okay.
We know from artifacts we found that people were here that early. What made this compelling was, number one, it was a significant elevation. It was high and dry, which is a very rare commodity in the Everglades. It had a diverse array of plants and animals that, again, added to their resource procurement and gave them a kind of defensive position, because in times of strife, being on an elevated island where you could look out over the Everglades, you could see both friend and foe approaching. So those were the real compelling reasons why these places were used over and over again. And when the Tequesta left, it was the Seminoles, the Miccosukee, who ended up using the exact same village sites and living in the same places.
So you're the archaeologist who has worked on excavating this site. What are some of the things that you've found?
The biggest surprise is there's a canal that was cut through here for later construction purposes. And in the dirt that had been moved off-site, we found mammoth bones, fossilized animals, megafauna going back at least 12,000 years, maybe even earlier. So we knew that there was a pre-human history that was of great interest. And then we discovered, in terms of the artifacts, we found pieces of pottery that had been shaped from clay that had different decorations on it. We found, in some cases, tools made out of shell, keeping in mind that there's no hard stone in South Florida. So the adaptation to that fact was simply to work with wood, to work with shell, to work with bone, to create all the different kinds of tools. In fact, the shells were used to make axes for cutting trees and for making canoes. And a lot of people don't realize that you can take a shell, certain types of shells, and shape them in a way, make an axe that actually works quite well.
Wow, that's a strong shell. We're in the middle of Broward County, right?
Yeah.
Very developed. And this site was previously used for something else. There was an amusement park here and a restaurant. What do you think on this site has potentially been lost?
Certainly parts of the islands have been destroyed by development, by roads traversing them, by the canal I mentioned earlier. But I think for the most part, this is probably one of the most best preserved archaeological sites in Broward, because it has overall had very little disturbance.
One of the hallmarks of the Tequesta and other ancient groups in South Florida are the mounds. I don't see any here.
There were no mounds. We never encountered any constructed mounds. They could have been here, but if they were here, they had been destroyed. But I didn't see any evidence that they had ever been here. So these were camps. Probably some of them were year-round habitation. That's one of the misconceptions, is that these people were nomads and just sort of wandering around. But what they probably did was they had stations for stopping at different times of the year for different kinds of resources, particularly on the coast when the sea turtles would come in. But basically, there were some permanent villages and camps, and I think there probably were several on this island as well.
Their main site was in Brickell, right? Modern day Brickell at the Miami Circle, essentially.
Well, there were two major towns for the Tequesta. One of them was at the mouth of the Miami River, and the second was near the mouth of the New River in Fort Lauderdale. Those were the two principal towns. But the main town, at least when the Europeans arrived, the principal town was at the mouth of the Miami River.
What about this site is unique compared to other sites that you've worked on?
What makes this site unique, it is part of a complex of sites on these islands. And for the most part, they're all connected. They're all preserved, which is amazing in modern Florida.
How willing do you think the local governments, developers, all the players are in making sure that sites like this stay preserved and are studied?
Well, certainly through local government, the commitment is made to preserve of the sites that have been set aside. Preserving future sites, though, future potential sites that could be preserved, is much more daunting because of the fact, as you mentioned, with the expansion of the population and growth has been overwhelming, making land prices prohibitive or easily acquiring them for public purposes. So I think in that sense, we're going to see there's not a lot of opportunity for new preservation.
What do you want people to know when they come here that this isn't just, let's say, a walk in the park, right? What's something for us to keep in mind as we visit?
I think for visitors to come here and make sure they experience the museum and exhibits, and it'll give them an in-depth sense of the heritage here is really important. And just walking around, they should enjoy this beautiful nature. They don't have to have a intellectual monologue going on. I mean, I think the main thing is they're going to experience what Native people, just think, how many places in South Florida can you go where you're actually in the same environment that Indigenous people were 1,000 years ago? I mean, this is one of the few places where you can have that experience.
All right, so I'm here with Lauren and Susan here at Long Key Nature Center. This is such a great site, and there's so many things that I want to be able to do here. So I'm an enthusiast, right? But what can people do if they really want to just do more than visit? They want to get involved and help support this amazing place.
Yeah, outside of the beautiful scenery and walking, I walk 3 miles every morning. We do look for volunteers with special activities. Some of them can include removing invasive plants. I see people doing things like that. But there's so many opportunities to help because it's a very small park and it doesn't have a lot of employees. So we try to help where we can, bring awareness, maybe raise some funds. Lauren, maybe you can add a few things to that?
Sure. So the other big part of it as a volunteer. So we are Friends of Long Key, and you can check us out at Folk Davy FL, or you can check out our website, Friends of Long Key. And we're always looking for volunteers, whether that's something like removing invasives from September to May. We do a lot of work out on the site, but you can also come in and volunteer for different programs and classes that we have going on with our naturalists. And just coming to the park and being present and being a visitor is a great way to get involved too.
That's great to know that there's so many things you can do. So please get involved and help support not just this place that preserves human history, but amazing natural history. So check the websites, the links, everything will be available. Come visit and get involved.